Hey folks, welcome to Pro Football Ireland. As we get closer to the season, we're getting to the point where it's 11 weeks to the season, almost there. Michaela and Michaela Fagan, delighted to be joined by a guy with the Baltimore Sun, covering the Ravens and the NFL. Brian Wacker. Brian, first off, it's our first time having you on here. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on. How are you doing?
Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate you guys having me on. Been to Ireland a few times. Lovely country, lovely people. Looking forward, of course, to going overseas again this year with the Ravens going to London. So that will be fun and a lot to talk about, obviously, with the NFL. So it's been a busy 3 months.
Very briefly, I guess, we do ask everyone this, like, you've been to Ireland. I know we've been talking off camera. You've been to both North and South. What did you enjoy about it? Because it's very different to Baltimore or Miami, where you've previously been as well.
Yes, just don't make me pick between the North and the South, because I don't want to start any wars here. Yes, I've been there a few times. For people that don't know, I used to cover golf, the PGA Tour, and of course, Rory McIlroy is a huge star over in that part of the world, and I've been fortunate to be over there a few times. Of course, they had the Open Championship at Portrush a few years ago, and was at that for Shane Lowry's victory there, which was fantastic. Incredible.
I was there as well. I don't mean to butt in, but that was Michaela. I know we're going to the whole golf talk now, but that, I'm sure you would have said it, and people listening to this, whether you're in Ireland, UK, like the feeling that day when he won that was something I've never experienced before. It was incredible, wasn't it?
It really was. Walking down that 18th fairway and just hearing the crowd and the flags and sort of the patriotism, it was spectacular. It was a rough day, as I recall, for Rory that day, but Shane Lowry was just brilliant, and really, just a lovely part of the world. And I hope more people get exposed to it and get to see it.
Now, jumping back into the football, because I'm not a big golf fan, I wouldn't have a lot about it. Of course, now we have lots of Baltimore Ravens fans in Europe, the UK, and Ireland, and everyone's really excited to see an MVP type quarterback playing in London, playing in the international games. Do you reckon a lot of people from the States will come over from Baltimore or anywhere else? Do you anticipate there be many fans going from the USA to London for the game?
That'll be interesting. I imagine so. The Ravens, while certainly I wouldn't say aren't the most popular team in the NFL, they certainly do have a very dedicated fan base, and they're extremely popular in Baltimore. I've only been in the area now for a little bit of time, but you can tell it's a passionate fan base, and they fill up the stadium every week, and would anticipate, folks making that trip. It's been a while. 2017 was the last time over there. Didn't go so well for the Ravens and John Harbaugh, and he was very vocal about that, of course. But I would expect there'll be a good contingent there for sure.
It's funny because, look, it's the easy cop out for any of us, including yourself, to say there's a lot of fans over there. There really is. Like, the Ravens are probably one of the most stronger supported franchises outside of the big 2 or 3 teams like the Packers and the Cowboys and the Giants and the Patriots. There's a lot of fans in Europe, but there's also a lot of fans in the UK, and I could really see them, Brian, filling that stadium up, which is it's not an easy feat, especially when it's so difficult to get tickets. You mentioned Coach Harbaugh there, and you sort of touched on it there. He didn't have the best experience, and he was the sort of man where if you spoke to him afterwards, he probably wouldn't have came back. The NFL has changed now, where it is, I can't quote the league, but it is very much outside of the team's grasp to an extent with this extra game. And I'm sure if the Ravens go to London now and win against Tennessee, they'll put that game behind them already, because that stadium is extremely different to the stadium they've played in already. Football turf, it's just a lot easier, the whole process also, just in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's funny. John mentioned that. You mentioned that game back in 2017, and he said, look, I don't have any interest in going back anytime soon. Give that job to somebody else. Well, now it's their job to go back, and he had sort of a wry smile when he found out when the schedule was announced. There was a suspicion, of course, that would happen, because a couple of the teams that are on their schedule or slated to play over there. Of course, the Jaguars being one, and that's who they played the last time over there. So it seemed to make sense that the Titans, who are also on the schedule, would be the team. And to your point, yeah, look, I think it's going to be very different this time from the standpoint of, the Ravens are in a bit different position right now. I would say with all the change, and look, we talked about this before the podcast, the last 3 months, it's been a dramatic turnaround there, roster makeover. They've got Lamar Jackson locked up for 5 years. There's a lot of positives, and they should be one of the favorites in the NFL this year. I think they will also learn from that experience. It sounds like they will go over maybe a little earlier than they did in their previous trip. I think coaches and teams, look, they're so regimented, and they really have things down to an efficient level. And so when you throw an overseas trip in there, particularly when you don't have a bye week the week before or the week after, which the Ravens do not have, really kind of throws a wrench into the schedule from the staff's perspective, from the coach's perspective. So, but all that said, look, I think they'll have it figured out a little bit better. It's teams have done it more often now. I think the routine is a little better in place, and certainly I'm sure they learned some lessons from that last trip over.
Talking about Lamar Jackson, he's clearly one of the best quarterbacks in the league, but one thing I've always noticed, and I think a lot of people have probably talked about, is that with him at the helm, they've only ever gotten as far as the divisional round. For someone who's an MVP quarterback, there's a lot of expectations for him. He's been given that new contract. Why do you think the Ravens always stutter in the playoffs? And do you think it was a lack of wide receiver talent, or do you think it was something else entirely?
I think that you bring up a fascinating point, Michaela, because to your point, right, Lamar Jackson is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, yet they haven't won the Super Bowl. They haven't even gotten to an AFC championship with him. I think there are a number of reasons here. You could go back to last year. Obviously, he was hurt. He didn't play in the game. They nearly still beat the Cincinnati Bengals in the playoff game. They had them right there on the 2-yard line. And of course, Tyler Huntley, the backup, tries to go in on a sneak, fumbles the ball, it gets returned for a touchdown, and that's the difference. If Lamar Jackson's in there, I'm not sure that happens. Look, this is a team that's got a world-class defense. I think now they've got some more talent around Lamar Jackson, particularly at wide receiver. This was a group last year that finished last by a long way in the NFL in receiving yards. And so, quarterbacks can only take you so far if you don't have somebody to throw the ball to. Look, they certainly have that in tight end Mark Andrews. They've got a couple of promising young guys, and guys like Isaiah Likely and Charlie Kohler at tight end. They've got a trio of good running backs led by J.K. Dobbins. Very good offensive line. Obviously, the defense we've talked about. But unless you put talent around guys, they're only going to take you so far. And that's true of, you can look at Josh Allen, you can look at Patrick Mahomes, you can go back to the Rams and their Super Bowl victories, Matthew Stafford and guys like Cooper Kupp. I mean, Lamar can't do it all on his own. Also, I think we've got a new defensive coordinator this year for the Ravens in Todd Monken. Again, Greg Roman was a guy who, was a run-heavy guy. That's what the Ravens sort of are known for. Not that they're going to completely abandon the running game, but I think you're going to see a more dynamic offense. I mean, we've already seen it in the offseason portion of the workouts where, this is a team that I think is going to throw more screen passes, certainly underneath stuff. They've done that a lot in the past. I think they will throw it downfield a bit more. You will see more intermediate stuff to the sidelines. So to me, that's, they've brought in guys like Odell Beckham Jr., who of course has questions coming off that torn ACL from a couple of years ago, or just over a year and a half ago. Nelson Aguilar, a veteran. They drafted Zay Flowers, who's a really promising young rookie. They've got a guy in Rashad Bateman, who's a talented wide receiver, young guy, but, he was hurt last year. So they lost him early on. He got off to a good start, then ended up missing the rest of the season because of foot surgery after 6 games. So I think right now, this team is set up to win and win big and go far. I don't know that they were really set up that way in the past 5 years as much as they are now. And, it'll be interesting. Of course, there's a loaded AFC, so it's a lot of hurdles to overcome.
Funny because we were talking with Jeff Reinbold, who's an analyst and the coach on our podcast network, about the AFC North just yesterday on a podcast, and I was arguing with him about the Browns and how Deshaun Watson has now had that full year of, in terms of normal, where he's training, he's in the facility. You've got the Bengals trying to take the next push, and you got year 2 of Kenny Pickett. Like this division, like everyone's talking about the AFC East, right? But this division's fascinating, man, isn't it? It really, really is the AFC North.
It is. Look, Cleveland gives the Ravens fits every year. It doesn't matter. You throw the record book out the window with these two, or actually, you can't throw it out the window, because if you look at historically the rivalry between these two in recent years, the Browns have been right there with the Ravens, and I think they're going to give them problems this year again. I still like the Ravens' chances in those games, but to your point, you get Deshaun Watson a year in the system. They've got some talent around him. It's a rivalry game, right? Pittsburgh, there's a guy in Kenny Pickett and some young receivers there, some talented receivers there. Of course, Joe Burrow in Cincinnati. That team's not going anywhere. Then you can look elsewhere. To your point, not just the AFC East, the AFC West. You've got what should be a better Denver Broncos team. You've got, of course, the Kansas City Chiefs, and of course the LA Chargers. So there is a ton of talent, in the AFC that the Ravens are going to have to deal with. And you look at the Ravens' schedule, the back half of that schedule in particular, it is not easy. There's 4 primetime games. All the tough games for them come in the back half of the schedule.
I know it's not like us to sit and let's go through all 16 games here. When you first seen the schedule for the Ravens, obviously that London game stands out. You've mentioned it already there, Brian. They have to play the Lions the week after. There's no rest for the wicked in that sense. They'll be straight out. Those guys get out of Stansted Airport before we even get back to Ireland, so they'll be fine. But just sort of wondering your thoughts on the schedule, because in terms of just the opponents that they have a few tough sketches there as well, especially towards the end.
Yeah, it's brutal. It's you've got the 49ers on Christmas night in San Francisco. You've got a Sunday night game at Jacksonville. We saw what they did last year in the playoffs, coming back against the Chargers. You've got the Chargers on a night game as well in LA. All the difficult games, guys, are at the end of the season. So to me, this is a team, when I saw the schedule, I thought, okay, this team will probably start something like 8-2. And then it gets really difficult, because you're talking about some of the best teams in football on their schedule. And then they close out the season with a home game against the Pittsburgh Steelers. You don't know what's going to happen there either. That could be an important game for one or both of those teams.
Now, a lot of Ravens fans, and I'm sure Lamar was very excited as well when the Ravens announced that they were bringing in Odell Beckham Jr., probably one of the most famous receivers in the last couple of years. But he did have a very infamous and kind of messy exit from the Cleveland Browns, and he is coming off back-to-back serious knee injuries. And his contract with the Ravens, in fairness, it's only a year, but it is worth up to $18 million. Do you think it was a bit of a risk bringing him in, just judging by his injury history over the last few seasons?
I mean, sure, there's always risk when you're talking about a guy who's had 2 serious knee injuries, but I think they looked at the landscape and, look, this wasn't an all-time wide receiver class in the draft. They got a very good one in Zay Flowers, a guy who rated, probably number 1 or 2 on a lot of teams' draft boards in terms of wide receivers. A guy who's he's going to play right away. I mean, he will see a lot of action in various roles. You'll see him in the slot. You'll see him out wide. I think you'll see him run the ball a couple of times, things like reverses. So, but I think they had to appease Lamar Jackson to to what you mentioned at the start. He was a guy who, you go back a few months, who had requested to be traded. And you look at last year's team, again, this is a group that finished last in the NFL in receiving yards by a wide margin. And so they had to do something to get a wide receiver in there. Certainly, they had salary cap issues. To your point, it's only a 1-year commitment. So I think they were very smart in terms of their commitment level to OBJ because of those things. But I do think he's a guy who can be a difference maker, not just in his abilities, which, look, clearly are diminished from what he was early on in his career. But last time we saw him, this guy, was probably on his way to potential MVP honors in the Super Bowl before he gets hurt. What impact will that have now? Again, I don't expect him to be quite the same receiver, but if you look at the landscape of the roster and the receivers they have, from tight end Mark Andrews, their running backs can catch the ball. Bring in Zay Flowers. They bring in a veteran like Nelson Aguilar, who at least early on has developed nice chemistry with Lamar so far. And I think it was a smart move. They had to do something. Reportedly that, Lamar had demanded or at least asked that they bring in Odell and DeAndre Hopkins. And the response was, look, we can't bring in both guys, but we can bring in one of them. And they brought in Odell. And that's a guy who, again, I think from not just his skill set, but I think his ability as a veteran guy, a leadership guy, a guy who, if you ask around the league in terms of being a good teammate, he is a good teammate. And I think he can sort of bestow some wisdom upon that otherwise young wide receiver group. They've only got a couple of guys who are around 30 years old, Odell being one of them, Aguilar being another. Most of the rest of the guys are fairly young, in their early to mid-20s. So I think what he brings, not just from a talent standpoint, but just from a leadership standpoint, and what he can bring to that room will be helpful.
We have a lot of fans listening that are Ravens fans, not just in Ireland, but in the UK as well. Shout out to UK Ravens that they're buzzing for this game this year. So I have to ask, Brian, I know you've only been covering the Ravens now with Baltimore Sun for a few months, but a lot of guys interested in David Ojabo. Big potential when he came in last year, obviously in the draft, and then he got that injury where it really sort of hampered that first year, and he had a chance to come in at the end of the season. Have you had a chance to see much of him so far, or is it general? Are there any whispers or sort of expectation going into year 2 for him? It's hopefully he has a big year.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's the expectation. They lost Calais Campbell up front and the sack production that he brought. Justin Houston, they lost him in his sack production, although they might be able to bring him back as a sort of on a lower deal for a veteran guy to have an experienced pass rusher. But look, there's no doubt about it. If you ask the Ravens, there is big expectation for David Ojabo and Odafe Awe. And Ojabo, look, I talked to Chuck Smith last week about this, their new outside linebackers coach. He said he's everything he thought he was at Michigan. He's quick, he's confident, he's twitchy, high pass rush IQ, mastered a lot of moves, said he's ready to have an impact right now. And, in a guy like Chuck Smith, I mean, this is a guy who had, I think, 58 and a half career sacks for the Atlanta Falcons, has been teaching pass rush for 20 years. I think he will have an impact on improving those guys. And you nailed it. I mean, look, this is a guy who was hurt right out of the box last year, gets hurt on his pro day, slips down a little bit. And, I think if it wasn't for that injury, he certainly would have probably had a pretty good year. And of course, you put him in there now with a group that includes guys like Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen. And I think that makes those guys' job easier because of that talent level around them. So again, I expect Ojabo to take a step up and frankly, he's going to need to in order for this defense to again be one of the best in the NFL.
We all remember when Lamar posted online that he intended on leaving the Ravens because they couldn't come to an agreement over his contract. And I know a lot of fans were upset. You know, they were losing a franchise quarterback nearly. But now that he's signed his contract, everything's fine now. But is there still members of the press or the fans in the city? Is there some people who are still a little bit upset that he went that far to nearly leave the Ravens, or is it all water under the bridge now?
I think it's mostly water under the bridge. I mean, certainly you have some fans, I think, who were not happy with the way it got done or the fact that it got done at all. I'm sure some fans wanted to move on from Lamar, and certainly, I guess that could have been a possibility. I'm not sure it ever really was a possibility, even with the trade demand. I think there was a lot of fatigue at one point between the organization and Lamar over this whole situation, which is dragged out for about 2 years before they finally got it done. That said, look, I think most people would be thrilled that Lamar is coming back. If nothing else, it's, there's commitment. There's commitment from both of them. We've seen Lamar show up at the voluntary organized team activities the past few weeks. He seems to, have taken some strides in the offense from what we've seen. Look, it's only mid-June, so it's still early days, but I think most people will be happy. I mean, again, this is a guy who is probably a generational quarterback, and look, you can argue about his success and what he's done or hasn't done, but these guys don't grow on trees. It's a lot harder to find them than it is to keep them. And so I think the Ravens were wise to do that and at least take their shot these next 5 years with Lamar and say, okay, this is it. We're built to win now. This is our window, and let's get it done.
Good to hear. I'm sure a lot of Ravens fans will be happy to hear that answer. It's a really interesting time in Baltimore. And it's funny, Brian, because just would love to know your sort of thoughts and expectations for this team this year. There's so many people over here that have very high expectations on the Ravens, which is funny because the AFC is stacked. It's a lot easier for an analyst or for a fan to say, well, yeah, Philly will be in the NFC Championship game, but Baltimore, it's harder to know because that AFC, the conference is just completely stacked and it's anyone's game. Be intrigued to hear what you think is sort of the ceiling for this team this year. Big year for Coach Harbaugh and a big year for Lamar Jackson as well.
Yeah, look, I think the ceiling is the Super Bowl, at least getting there. There's no doubt they have the defense. The offense, I think there's still some question marks. To Michaela's point, like we don't know what we're going to get out of Odell Beckham in terms of production. We don't really know for sure quite the impact that a guy like Zay Flowers will have. There's still questions about their edge rushers. I think there's some questions maybe in the secondary in terms of, how that will play out. They've had some guys come and go there and at the corner and safety position. So, to me, they're still the offensive line. There's going to be a competition for the starting left guard spot for the second year in a row, which is, not a hugely important, probably the least important position on the offensive line. But if you're a team that's going to run a lot of screens and things of that nature, you need linemen who can move and get out and block. And so that will be important, who wins that job. So, the expectation, look, I think if you're an optimist, I think you could say certainly the AFC Championship. I think if you're a pessimist, you just, you look at their past and you look at their history of since their Super Bowl win a decade ago, they've got just 2 playoff wins. So not great. Now, again, some of that Lamar Jackson was hurt. Some of that Lamar Jackson didn't play well. Some of that Lamar didn't have the talent that he had around him, that he has around him now. So, but there's no question this team is built to win now, from the offense to the defense. But I think the bigger problem is really twofold. You've got the back half of that schedule is really difficult. And I'm not sure that there's a real history of teams having a really difficult second half of their season and then making a deep run in the playoffs. And then also, I think you have to look at the rest of that conference. To your point, AFC East is loaded. You've got the New York Jets now, Buffalo Bills, The Dolphins are coming. The Patriots, you can never really count them out. I think, they're certainly on the backside of that. But then you look at the AFC West, and you got Kansas City again. You've got, LA in the expectations with the Chargers, perhaps a better Broncos team, although probably not a team that contends there too deep in the playoffs. And you've got in your own backyard the Cincinnati Bengals. So that to me, that's a lot of hurdles to overcome to get to the Super Bowl this year. So that said, look, you never know. Somebody gets hurt on a different team. Things break your certain way. It's impossible to predict. Certainly, the AFC is far more loaded than the NFC. I think the Ravens do have a tough road to get to the Super Bowl. I think certainly they could get to an AFC championship. I think with this roster, I think you have to at least get to the AFC championship. Anything short of that, I don't want to say is a failure, but is probably, underwhelming.
I fully agree. I completely agree. Brian, you've been very gracious with your time. Really, really appreciate it, man. At Brian Wacker 1 on both Twitter and Instagram. Check out the Baltimore Sun for Brian's articles as well. Brian, we'll happily get you a coffee or a Guinness in London, see it travels over, and we'll see you soon. And enjoy training camp and enjoy the start of the season. We're definitely not that long away now.
Can't wait, guys. Looking forward to it, and I will definitely take you off on that coffee. Maybe a pint. Probably have to go with a pint, of course, right? Again, it truly is better over there. So at least in Ireland. So I'm not sure about London if it's still better than over here. But
wait until you see the delicacies around Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. We will certainly try and show you anyway. Thanks so much, man. Appreciate it.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, guys.